Fleet scribe Zun had recorded the death of 14 worlds. He had watched their final transmissions, the panic, the prayers, the silence. He was good at his job. He wrote without feeling. But as his stylus moved across the log panel, something made him pause. The humans were not screaming. He checked the sensors again. The third planet from the yellow star sat quiet in its orbit. No military signals, no emergency broadcasts, no evacuation chatter. 4,000 Dravith warships had crossed the outer belt of their solar system 3 days ago. The humans had tracking capability, primitive but functional. They had to know. And yet nothing. Zun wrote it down anyway. Target civilization shows no response to fleet approach. Conclude, unaware, incapable, or resigned. At the front of the command deck, High Warlord Gorax stood with his arms crossed and his chest full of pride. He was a large creature even by Dravith standards, gray-plated, four-armed, with eyes that had watched 100 civilizations crumble. He had not lost a campaign in 30 years. He did not expect to lose one now. "Sleeping prey," he said, loud enough for the whole bridge to hear. Some of the officers laughed. Sub-Commander Vel-On did not. Vel-On stood near the back of the deck, staring at his own screen. The data bothered him. Not the silence. Silence could mean fear. What bothered him was the thermal readings. Deep beneath the surface of the planet, beneath the oceans, beneath the stone, there were power signatures. Faint, steady, like something breathing slowly on purpose. He pulled up the asteroid belt scans next. Unremarkable rocks, dust, ice. But two of the larger bodies had slightly irregular mass distribution. He flagged it and said nothing. Gorax would not want to hear it. The fleet moved on. Far below, under 300 meters of reinforced Earth, Admiral Nora Hale sat in a chair that had never been comfortable and drank water that had never been cold enough. The Global Command bunker smelled like recycled air and old metal. She had spent more hours in this room than in her own home over the last 4 years. Dr. Felix Reyes stood at the main display wall, pulling up trajectory models. He was a small man with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, the kind of person who looked more at home in a university library than a war room. But he had designed half the systems currently powering up across the solar system, so no one questioned his presence. "Fleet is past the belt," said Corporal Sita Rao from her station. She was young, 26, maybe 27, and she kept her voice flat and professional even though her hands were tight on the edge of her console. "Holding current speed, no deviation." Director Yusuf Bello stood near the back, watching. He was the head of the Global Defense Council, the man who had signed off on 40 years of secret construction, secret funding, secret everything. He had carried that secret through 3 different governments, 2 global recessions, and 1 very uncomfortable conversation with his wife. He looked at Nora. "Are we ready?" he asked. Nora did not look away from the display. "We have been ready," she said. "We have been ready for 11 years." Felix pulled up the full grid map. Across the solar system, thousands of structures sat in complete darkness. No emissions, no heat signatures, no active power. To any scanner passing through, they looked like rocks, debris, nothing. They had been built that way, hidden in plain sight, the orbital platforms behind the moons, the railgun arrays inside hollowed asteroids, the kill drone bays drifting in slow orbits around the outer planets. And at the center of it all, wrapped around Earth's equatorial ring station like a sleeping giant, the Sunder Array. Felix had spent 19 years building the Sunder Array. He did not talk about it much. He just smiled sometimes when he passed the schematics. Sita pulled up a new reading. "Fleet is accelerating. They are moving into assault formation." On the Dravith command deck, Gorax gave the order to begin the planetary assault sequence. Across 4,000 ships, weapon systems warmed. Targeting arrays locked onto the blue planet. Troop carriers prepared for atmospheric descent. Zun recorded everything. He noted the formation. He noted the time. He noted that the planet still had not responded. Then he noted something else. One of the asteroid-mounted relay stations they had passed 20 minutes ago had just changed temperature by 0.3 degrees. It was nothing. It was the kind of reading that got ignored in a battle log. Zun did not ignore it. He stared at it for a long time. Vel-On appeared beside him without a word. He had seen it too. The two of them looked at each other across the narrow aisle of the record station. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing to say that Gorax would listen to. Back in the bunker, Sita Rao pressed 2 fingers against her earpiece. Her voice did not shake. She had practiced this moment in her head so many times that it felt less like fear and more like memory. "Grid online in 3, she said quietly. Nora stood up from her chair. 2. Felix closed his laptop. 1. The lights on the display wall changed from blue to white. Across the solar system, in the dark between rocks and silence and cold space, thousands of things that had been sleeping for a very long time opened their eyes. Zun's stylus stopped moving. He had recorded the fall of 14 worlds. He knew what a dying civilization looked like on a sensor screen. It looked like noise, panic transmissions, desperate energy bursts, ships launching in every direction at once. It looked like a system falling apart. What his screen showed now was the opposite. Across the solar system, structures were activating in sequence, not randomly, not desperately, in a careful, deliberate order, like someone following a plan they had rehearsed many times. Orbital platforms rose from behind moons, large, heavily plated, already rotating to face the fleet. Railgun arrays unfolded from the surface of asteroids that Zun had marked as empty rock 3 days ago. Drone bays, hidden inside debris clusters at the edge of the belt, cracked open and began releasing small, dark shapes in vast numbers. And around the third planet itself, something enormous was spinning up. Zun had no name for it. His sensors could measure its power output, but could not explain what it was designed to do. The energy signature was unlike anything in the Dravith archive. It was centered on a ring structure around the planet's equator, a structure that had not appeared on any of their earlier scans because it had been built to absorb sensor signals rather than reflect them. He pulled up the count of active signatures. 14,209. He read the number 3 times. 14,209 separate weapon or defense structures, now active across a single star system. The largest Dravith campaign in history had deployed 9,000 units. He wrote the number down in his log and then sat very still for a moment. 40 years before this day, in a small government building in a city called Geneva, a group of exhausted humans had sat around a table with a single piece of evidence in front of them. It was an intercepted Dravith scout signal, automated, old, never meant to be found. It had been moving through their outer system for 11 years before a deep space relay station caught it. The signal was not a threat. It was a survey, a quiet, clinical assessment of Earth's resources, population density, and military capability. The kind of document an empire made before it decided whether to add something to its list. The humans in that room had looked at each other for a long time. One of them, a physicist named Dr. Hadley Reyes, Felix's father, had put his hand flat on the table and said, "We have one choice. Build. Build everything. Build it where they cannot see it. And when they come, make sure nothing goes home." The vote had been unanimous. What followed was the largest secret construction project in human history. It crossed governments, borders, and generations. Funding was hidden inside infrastructure budgets, climate programs, deep space research grants. Workers signed contracts that did not describe what they were actually building. Components were manufactured on 3 different continents and assembled in space by crews who communicated in rotating code phrases. Felix had grown up knowing pieces of it. His father had told him just enough. When Felix was old enough, he joined the program. When his father died, he took over the Sunder Array project and spent the next 19 years finishing what the old man had started. He thought about his father sometimes when the bunker was quiet. He was not thinking about him now. "Formation shift," said Sita from her console. Her voice was steady. "Vanguard is tightening. They are pulling into closer grouping." Felix looked at his screen and then at Nora. Nora was already looking at him. "Vel on," she said quietly. It was not a question. She had read the Draveth Tactical Archive twice, captured fragments from 3 previous campaigns. She knew Sub-Commander Vel On's signature move. When he did not like a situation, he pulled the fleet tighter for mutual defense. It was a good instinct. It was also, in this case, exactly what she needed him to do. On the Draveth Bridge, Vel On had already said everything he intended to say. He had shown Gorax the activation count. He had shown him the power readings from the equatorial ring. He had said, plainly and without drama, "This system was prepared for us. We should withdraw and reassess." Gorax had looked at the numbers. Then he had looked at Vel On with the expression he used for officers who asked him to be afraid. "One primitive world," Gorax said, 14,000 decorations. They built toys to look dangerous. We have broken civilizations that built wonders." He turned back to the forward display. "Hold formation. Continue approach." Vel On returned to his station. He did not argue. There was no point. He had served Gorax for 18 years and knew every version of that look. He pulled up a private log channel instead and began recording. Not for the Empire, not for the campaign archive, just for himself, just so that something honest existed somewhere. "The humans built this over decades," he said quietly. "They knew we were coming and they said nothing. They let us walk in. Whatever happens next, they planned it." He paused. "I think we made a mistake." Back in the bunker, the first drone swarm had finished its launch sequence. 10,000 autonomous kill units, each one the size of a ground vehicle, were now drifting outward in absolute silence. No engine heat, no active signals, completely invisible to standard Draveth sensors. Sita watched the timer on her screen count down. Felix leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. 4 minutes, he said. Nobody spoke. The first sign was a sound. Not on the Draveth ships. In space there is no sound. The sound was in Zun's chest, a feeling he had no proper word for. The sensors began screaming all at once, and his body understood before his mind did that something had gone very wrong. The Vanguard, 600 of the Empire's frontline warships, disappeared from clean formation into chaos in the span of 4 minutes. Not from a beam weapon, not from missiles they could track and shoot down, from thousands of small, fast, silent objects that had been sitting in the dark between stars and waiting. The kill drones hit the Vanguard from every direction at once. No formation, no arc, no predictable pattern. They moved the way a swarm moves, not with strategy but with density. There were simply too many of them hitting too many places at once. The Draveth point defense systems were excellent. They had been refined over 200 years of warfare. They could track and destroy incoming missiles, fighter craft, even debris accelerated to weapon speeds. They were built for targets they could see coming. They were not built for 10,000 objects the size of ground vehicles moving at irregular velocities with no heat signature and no active signal. By the time the targeting systems registered 1, 3 more had already hit. 312 ships were destroyed or crippled in the first 4 minutes. Another 40 were damaged badly enough to fall out of formation. The Vanguard, which had entered the inner system in a clean speartip shape, was now a scattered field of burning hulls and debris clouds. Zun wrote it all down. His hands did not shake. He had trained them not to. But the numbers on his screen had no historical parallel. No fleet had ever lost this many ships this fast to a civilization that was not supposed to have this technology. He added a note in the margin of his log. Reassess all prior intelligence on human capability. Prior intelligence appears to be entirely wrong. On the command deck, Gorex was not laughing anymore. He was shouting instead orders, counterorders, tactical adjustments. His four arms moved across three different control surfaces at once. He was not panicking. He was solving the problem the way he had always solved problems, with force, with speed, with aggression. He called the fleet into a tighter defensive grouping. Pull in. Close the gaps. Let the point defense systems overlap and create a wall of fire that nothing could penetrate. Vel-An heard the order and felt something cold settle in his stomach. He almost said something. He stopped himself. Because the order made sense from the outside, from a normal tactical situation, pulling the fleet together was correct. But in this situation, with that power signature still building around the planet's equatorial ring, with whatever the humans had built down there still spinning up, tightening the formation meant giving it a single target. He looked at his screen. He looked at the ring station's energy output, which had been climbing steadily for the last 20 minutes. He pulled up the mass calculation. He ran the numbers twice. He sat down slowly and began recording again. In the bunker, Felix watched the formation data update in real time and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Nora and said what he had said in 17 simulations, in 12 review meetings, in one very long conversation with his father's old notes. They just handed us the shot. Nora did not smile. She never smiled during operations. She just nodded once and looked at Sita. "Sunder targeting lock," she said. Sita's fingers moved across her board. "Locking. Formation center is tight. They have pulled into mutual defense grouping. Optimal compression. We have maximum overlap." Sergeant Dara Owen stood near the back wall with his arms folded and his jaw tight. He had spent 30 years in uniform. He had fought in 2 off-world conflicts and one very bad situation in the asteroid belt that nobody talked about anymore. He was not a scientist. He did not understand half of what the Sunder array was supposed to do, but he understood what he was looking at on the screen. 40 years, he said, mostly to himself. We spent 40 years scared out of our minds that this would happen. Nora heard him. She did not look away from the display. "We were scared," she said, "so we got to work." Owen nodded once. That was enough. "Sunder lock confirmed," said Sita. "Array at full charge, ready on your order." The Sunder array was not a beam weapon. It did not fire anything in the traditional sense. What it did was bend gravity briefly, sharply, in a focused column, in a way that created a tidal stress effect across any physical structure inside the target zone. The effect lasted less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds was enough. Metal that was built to withstand beam weapons and missiles and kinetic impacts was not built to withstand being pulled in 3 directions at once at the molecular level. Ships did not explode. They came apart. Quietly, the way old buildings come apart in an earthquake, from the inside along seams that were never meant to take that kind of stress. Nora looked at the display for one more second. "Fire," she said. The Sunder array fired. The gravity pulse moved outward from the equatorial ring at the speed that such things move fast enough that the fleet had no warning, no time to scatter, no time to do anything except exist inside the target zone and then cease to. 470 ships came apart in the span of 3 seconds. The Dravith fleet lost a third of its remaining strength in less time than it took Zund to finish writing his last sentence. He stared at the screen, then he wrote one more line. "They are not defending, they are executing a plan." At the front of the bridge, Gorak stood very still for the first time since the engagement began. Then his eyes went dark and flat in the way they did when he had decided something that could not be undone. "Full charge," he said. "All ships, maximum thrust. We hit the planet directly." 1,843 ships. That was what was left of the Dravith fleet when the charge began. less than half of what had crossed the asteroid belt 3 days ago. Still a force large enough to glass a continent. Still enough firepower to break a planet if it hit all at once. Gorax knew this. He had calculated it before he gave the order. If the Empire was going to lose this battle, and that word, lose, sat in his chest like a stone he refused to swallow, then the humans would lose their world first. A dead planet sent its own kind of message. The next civilization that tried what humanity had tried would see a burned rock and remember the cost. The fleet charged. In the bunker, the charge showed up on the main display as a wall of red icons moving inward in a compressed mass. Sita read off the numbers quietly. Speed, trajectory, estimated time to upper atmosphere. Her voice was as flat as a machine's. She had been awake for 19 hours. Nora watched the display and said nothing for a moment. Then she turned to Felix. "Scenario 7, she said. Felix had already pulled it up. Scenario 7 was the Berserker Charge, the last resort move of a fleet that had decided to trade its life for the target. It was in the Dravith Tactical Archive, documented in 3 prior campaigns. Nora had marked it as the most likely final stage response the first time she read it. She had spent 2 years designing the answer. The answer was the orbital railgun grid. 2,400 individual railgun platforms sat in overlapping orbital shells around Earth, low orbit, mid-orbit, high orbit. Each one had a firing arc that intersected with the arcs of at least 4 others. There were no gaps. There were no angles of approach that led to the planet without passing through at least one firing corridor. Nora had checked this personally, with Felix's math behind her, 312 times over 6 years of testing. A ship moving fast in a straight line was the easiest target in physics. Mass, velocity, trajectory, all predictable, all locked in the moment the engines committed to full thrust. The faster a ship went, the easier it was to calculate where it would be 4 seconds from now. The railgun grid activated. It did not activate in a blaze of light and noise the way old war films showed. It activated in precise, cycling bursts, each gun firing in a coordinated sequence, so that there was never a pause in coverage, never a window where a ship could slip through between shots. The timing had been calculated down to the millisecond. Felix had written the firing algorithm himself. He had then rewritten it 4 times until he was satisfied. Ships began to die. Not all at once. The outer edge of the charge hit the first firing corridor and the kills began there, 1 ship, then 2, then a cluster of 5 caught in overlapping arcs. The ones behind them tried to adjust course. Course adjustments at that speed were small, marginal, not enough. The grid recalculated in real time and kept firing. In the record station, Zun watched his screen and kept writing. His log was the most complete battle record in Dravith history, and he knew it. Whatever happened to him today, the record would survive. The ship's data core was armored and designed to eject automatically in a terminal event. Somewhere, eventually, someone would read what he had written. He wrote carefully. The humans designed this defense with the assumption that we would do exactly what we are doing. They did not build a wall, they built a system. The difference is significant. A wall can be broken through at one point. A system has no one point. Every action we take was anticipated. Every response we make leads to a worse position. This is not a battle. This was a designed outcome. He paused and then added one more line. Velon was right. Velon was not on the bridge anymore. He had returned to the record station 10 minutes ago and sat down without explanation. He was not recording. He was just sitting. His eyes moved across the data, but he had stopped processing it the way a tactical officer processes data. He was just watching, witnessing. At some point he said, quietly to no one in particular, Ambassador Dorek told the High Council this would happen. Not in these exact words, but he said, do not go to the human system. He said they were unlike the others. He said they had been afraid of something and that afraid things build walls. He looked at his screen. He was wrong about only one part. They did not build walls. Zun did not look up. They built a trap, he said. Vel-On nodded, and we walked into it. 14 civilizations taught us that the ones who build wonders die quietly, so we stopped looking for the ones who build quietly. He folded his hands on the console. I hope Dorek is alive to hear how this ended. He deserves to know he was right. On the display, Gorex's flagship was in the lead, a massive command vessel 3 kilometers long, designed to survive planetary bombardment. It had taken hits. Several of its secondary systems were gone. It was trailing debris and venting atmosphere from 3 decks, but its main drives were intact, and it was still moving forward because Gorax was still alive and Gorax did not stop. It entered the outer edge of the upper atmosphere. The hull began to glow. In the bunker, Felix watched the flagship's descent trajectory and tapped the final authorization code into his console. Final contingency is ready, he said. Director Yusuf Bello, who had not spoken in 40 minutes, looked up from the back of the room. Nora did not hesitate. Activate it, she said. From the surface of the Earth, on a clear night in the northern plains, a farmer named Rowan stepped outside to check on his animals. He did not know about the bunker. He did not know about the fleet. He did not know about the 40-year construction project or the Sunder Array or the orbital railgun grid. What he knew was that something had been lighting up the sky for the last hour in ways he had never seen before, flashes in the high atmosphere, brief and bright, like lightning that moved sideways instead of down. He stood in the cold and looked up. What he saw next was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in his life. Across the whole sky, from horizon to horizon, streaks of white and gold and pale blue light were falling. Hundreds of them. Thousands. They moved slowly enough to watch, burning long trails that stayed lit for minutes before fading. The streaks overlapped and crossed each other like the threads of some enormous pattern being drawn by hand. His daughter came out behind him. She was 9 years old and had been awake because of the light through her window. She looked up and grabbed his hand and said, "Dad, is that real?" "Yes," he said. "What is it?" He did not know the true answer. He gave her the only one he had. "I think it's a meteor shower," he said, "a big one." She watched it for a long time without speaking. Then she said it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He agreed. Neither of them slept that night. They brought out blankets and sat in the field and watched the sky until the last streak faded near dawn. 80 kilometers above their heads, Gorex's flagship was gone. The final contingency was a ground-based missile network, surface-to-space launchers embedded in mountain ranges, ocean platforms, and remote terrain across every continent. Mass driver assisted, which meant they left the atmosphere at hypersonic speed before their main drives even engaged. Nuclear-tipped, designed not to destroy planets but to destroy individual ships in the upper atmosphere, to catch whatever the orbital grid had missed and make sure it never made contact with the surface. The flagship had been hit by the grid 17 times. It had survived all 17. It was a remarkable ship. It was built by a civilization that had never lost. The missile network fired in a ripple pattern, not all at once, but in a sequence calculated to cover every possible debris trajectory if the target broke apart mid-strike. The flagship took 4 missiles in rapid sequence. The 5th was redundant. The ship broke apart at altitude. The pieces burned. Some were small enough to fully vaporize. Some were large enough to glow all the way down and leave long golden trails across the sky. Gorax did not make a final speech. He did not leave a final log entry. The bridge was gone by the 2nd missile. He had been a creature of certainty his entire life, and he died the same way he had lived, moving forward, not stopping, right up until the moment there was nothing left to move. In the bunker, the feeds went quiet one by one. The last active Dravith signature in the inner system winked out on Sita's screen at 3:47 hours, local time. She noted the timestamp in the log. Then she sat back in her chair and stared at the ceiling. The engagement had lasted 47 minutes. 4,000 ships, 47 minutes. Nora stood at the display wall for a long time after the screens cleared. The room was very quiet. Someone coughed. Someone else let out a long, slow breath. Nobody spoke because there was nothing to say that felt equal to the moment. After a while, Nora sat down. Not in her usual chair, she sat on the edge of a supply crate near the back wall, which was not a dignified place for the commanding admiral of Earth's defense grid to sit. She put her elbows on her knees and her face in her hands, and she breathed. Sita watched her for a moment. Then she got up and walked over. "Admiral," she said quietly, "are you all right?" Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Ask me in a week." Sita nodded and went back to her station. Director Yusuf Bello walked to the center of the room and stood there with his hands in his pockets. He was 63 years old. He had been carrying this secret since he was 29. He had spent 34 years moving money, signing documents, making phone calls, attending meetings where people argued about budgets without knowing what the budget was actually building. He looked at the cleared screens and thought about all the people who had worked on this and never lived to see it end. He thought about Dr. Hadley Ray's, dead 11 years, who had put his hand flat on a table in Geneva and said, "Build everything." He thought about the 14 worlds that had not been ready. He thought about the one that had been. Outside the solar system, at the very edge of scanner range, a single Dravith ship sat in the dark. It was a records vessel, lightly armed, slow, built for documentation rather than combat. It had been positioned at the fleet's rear as standard protocol, far enough back to observe the full engagement without being in it. Fleet Scribe Zun sat at his console and looked at his screen. The inner system was quiet. The fleet was gone. He had watched every stage of the engagement from beginning to end, and he had written all of it down with the same careful, steady hand he had used for 14 other worlds. He sat for a long time without writing. Then he began his final entry. "The humans knew we were coming. They did not run. They did not ask for peace. They did not broadcast strength or make threats. They waited. They let us commit fully. Then they removed us. The engagement lasted 47 minutes. I am the only ship remaining. I am going home. I do not know if the Empire will believe my record. I do not know if it matters." He paused. "I think they let me live. I think they saw me on their sensors and made a decision. I think the message was deliberate." He closed the log. He pointed his ship toward home and engaged the drive. The vote was not close. 11 members of the Global Defense Council sat in a room that smelled of old coffee and tension. On the table in front of them was a single data point. One Dravith record ship, sitting at the edge of the solar system, making no aggressive move, transmitting no signals, just pointing toward home and waiting. Some council members wanted to destroy it. The argument was simple: no witnesses, no retaliation intelligence, no chance of the Empire learning exactly how the grid worked. Eliminate the variable. Others said nothing. They looked at Nora Hale, who was sitting at the far end of the table with dark circles under her eyes and a cup of water she had not touched. Director Yusuf Bello asked her to speak. She did not stand up. She spoke from her chair plainly, the way she did everything. "Killing that ship accomplishes one thing," she said. "It erases the story, and the story is the point. The Dravith Empire has 14 dead civilizations in its history. Every one of them fought back or ran or begged. None of them did what we did. If Zun goes home with his log intact, the Empire gets a complete record of every stage of this engagement, the preparation, the patience, the execution. They will understand that we did not get lucky. They will understand that we waited for them specifically." She paused. "That is a more powerful deterrent than anything we could fire at them." The vote was 11-0. They let the ship go. Before Zun's vessel crossed the outer belt, Earth broadcast a signal on all known Dravith communication frequencies. It was not long. It was not delivered with music or ceremony. Director Bello sat in front of a single camera in a plain room and read it aloud in a measured voice. We have been watching your empire for 40 years. We counted your fleets. We studied your tactics. We learned your history. We built accordingly. We did not want this war. Your empire chose to bring it to our home. We are still here. Your fleet is not. We will continue watching. That is all. The signal was transmitted once. No repetition. No translation offered because the Dravith had been scanning human communications long enough that their systems would handle it. Zun received the transmission 11 minutes after it was sent. He listened to it twice, then he added it verbatim to his log without comment. He did add one note beneath it. They transmitted this once. They did not shout. They did not threaten. They stated a fact and ended the message. I have recorded the communications of 14 civilizations in their final hours. None of them sounded like this. The journey home was long. Zun had time to read his own log from the beginning, all of it, from the first entry as the fleet crossed the outer belt to the final transmission from the blue planet. He read it the way he would read any historical record, looking for the turning point, the moment where things could have gone differently. He found it early, earlier than he expected. It was not the drone swarm or the railgun grid or the gravity weapon. It was the silence. The 11 days of silence before the grid activated. That was when the battle had actually been decided not by weapons, but by patience. The Dravith had been given 11 days to turn around. 11 days to see the thermal signatures, to notice the irregular asteroid masses, to listen to Vel-On, to consider Ambassador Dorak's warnings. 11 days. And they had spent every one of them assuming they were the most dangerous thing in the room. Zun filed his complete record with the Empire's Central Archive the moment he crossed into Dravith space. He did not summarize. He did not soften the numbers. He sent every sensor reading, every tactical log, every stage of the engagement in full. He attached Vel-On's private recordings. He attached his own final notes. The archive classification came back within hours. Highest restriction, Council eyes only. He never found out what the Council did with it. He was a scribe, not a strategist. His job was the record, not the response. He retired from fleet service 14 months later and spent the remaining years of his life in a quiet city writing histories of campaigns he had witnessed. He never wrote about Earth directly. The record existed. Anyone who needed to read it could find it. He did add one line to his personal memoir, near the end, in a chapter about what made a civilization dangerous. The most fearful thing is not the one that roars. It is the one that measures you carefully, says nothing, and prepares. Back on Earth, Felix Reyes was outside. He had driven out past the city lights to a field he had been coming to since he was a child, flat ground, no trees in the way, a full view of the sky in every direction. His father had brought him here the first time. They had laid on their backs in the summer grass and counted stars, and his father had told him that some of those stars had something watching from them. He had asked at 7 years old if that was scary. His father had said, "Only if you're not ready." Sita Rao found him there. She had tracked his vehicle out of the city. She was, among other things, very good at finding people. She parked and walked across the field and stood beside him, looking up. "Do you think others are watching?" she asked. "Out there, other empires, other fleets." Felix kept his eyes on the sky. "Almost certainly," he said. She looked at him. "Does that scare you?" He was quiet for a moment. The stars were very bright out here, away from the lights. He could see the faint band of the galaxy crossing overhead, the same band his father had pointed at with one hand and said, "Something is out there." He thought about 40 years of work. He thought about the 14 worlds that had burned. He thought about a farmer in the northern plains who had seen the sky light up and thought it was beautiful and had no idea what it meant. He thought about Zun's ship, crossing the dark between stars, carrying a record of what happened when an empire chose the wrong world. Felix smiled. "Let them watch," he said. Above them, the stars did not answer. They just burned, the way they always had, old and patient and very, very far away. Somewhere in the Dravith archive, sealed under the highest classification level the Empire possessed, Fleet Scribe Zun's complete record sat in a data vault that required 3 council members to open. The entry on the final page was short. "Do not engage, coordinates restricted." The star was circled in red. It was never crossed again.